story began in a small provincial town whose name I prefer not to mention. Suffice it to say, it was a place where time seemed to have stopped somewhere in the middle of the last century, where everyone knew everyone and news spread faster than a wildfire. I worked as a journalist for the local newspaper, which in a town like that meant writing about agricultural successes, school concerts, and rare incidents like a barn fire or a missing cow. The work was monotonous and boring, but it allowed me to live peacefully without major upheavals, which suited me perfectly after a turbulent youth in a big city. My apartment was on the second floor of an old brick building, its windows overlooking the central square. Every morning I woke up to the sound of the local church bell, ate oatmeal with honey for breakfast, and headed to the editorial office located just 3 blocks from my home. The editorial office was in the basement of the administrative building, and my workspace consisted of an old wooden desk piled with papers and an antiquated computer that worked intermittently. The editor-in-chief, Pyotr Semenovich, was an elderly man who believed that true journalism had ended with the Soviet Union and constantly disapproved of my work. I spent my evenings alone, reading books or strolling through the quiet streets of the town. I had no family and few close friends, and this life suited me. I was used to the silence, to the measured rhythm of provincial existence, to the fact that the most significant event of the day might be the arrival of a new batch of bread at the store or a conversation with a neighbor about the weather. The only thing that disturbed this calm was my memories of the past, which occasionally surfaced, reminding me that I had once been a different person, lived a different life. Everything changed on a cold October morning when Anna Mikhailovna, the wife of the local math teacher, burst into the editorial office. She was extremely agitated, her usually neat hairstyle disheveled, and her eyes red from tears. Anna Mikhailovna told a story that at first seemed like just another piece of gossip, but later turned my life upside down. Her husband, Mikhail Petrovich, had gone into the forest for mushrooms the previous evening. He was an experienced mushroom picker, knew all the trails in the area, and never stayed in the forest longer than a few hours. But this time, he didn't return home that evening or night. The forest Anna Mikhailovna spoke of was about 5 kilometers from the town. Locals simply called it the far forest, in contrast to the near forest, which began just beyond the town's outskirts. The far forest was larger, denser, and only the bravest mushroom pickers and hunters went there. I only knew about this forest by hearsay. I had never been there myself, but I heard it was famous for an abundance of porcini mushrooms and game. However, recently fewer and fewer people went there, and the reasons for this I was yet to discover. Anna Mikhailovna pleaded with me to write an article about her husband's disappearance, to organize a search, and to draw the attention of the authorities. She said she had gone to the police, but they told her that a person is only considered missing after 3 days, and until then, she had to wait. I promised to help her, though I privately doubted I could do anything truly useful. My experience working for the local newspaper taught me that most incidents in our town resolved themselves, and journalistic investigations rarely yielded any results. However, Anna Mikhailovna's story captivated me. Perhaps because it disrupted the usual flow of my monotonous life, or perhaps because in that woman's gaze I saw something that made me believe in the seriousness of what was happening. I decided to conduct my own investigation, starting with conversations with locals who might know something about the far forest and what was happening there. The first person I spoke to was Vasily Ivanovich, an old hunter who lived on the outskirts of town in a small house with an overgrown garden. Vasily Ivanovich was a man of few words, but when I mentioned the far forest, his face darkened, and he remained silent for a long time, staring at his hands. Finally, he said that strange things happened in that forest and that smart people didn't go there. He told me a story about how, about 3 years ago, his acquaintance, a young man named Sergei, went there and only returned a year later, claiming he had spent only a few hours in the forest. This story seemed incredible to me, but Vasily Ivanovich spoke seriously, without a trace of a smile. He said that Sergei had changed greatly after his return, becoming withdrawn, often speaking of voices he heard in the forest and of time flowing differently there. A few months later, Sergei left town, and nothing had been heard from him since. Vasily Ivanovich warned me that it was better not to meddle with that forest, but I had already made up my mind. I spent the next few days gathering information about the far forest. I talked to people, read old newspaper issues, and studied maps of the area. Gradually, a picture began to emerge before me, becoming increasingly frightening. It turned out that Sergei's case was not isolated. Over the past 10 years, several people had gone missing in the far forest, and most of them returned months or even years later, claiming they had spent only a few hours there. Some never returned at all. Moreover, I discovered that similar stories had been told before. They just weren't written about in the newspaper. Locals knew about it but preferred not to speak aloud, as if hoping that silence would help avoid trouble. I began to understand why fewer and fewer people went to the far forest in recent years, despite the fact that the mushrooms and berries there were better than anywhere else in the area. My life fundamentally changed during these days. I started sleeping poorly, often waking up in the middle of the night from strange dreams in which I saw dark trees and heard distant voices. During the day, I was distracted, barely coping with my usual journalistic duties. All my thoughts were occupied by the mystery of the far forest. Pyotr Semenovich reprimanded me several times about the quality of my work, but I barely heard his words. I knew I was approaching something important, the unraveling of a mystery that could become a real journalistic investigation, a case that could change my dull career as a provincial journalist. But at the same time, I felt a growing anxiety, a premonition that some secrets are best left undisturbed, that there are things a person should not encounter. Nevertheless, I continued my investigation, driven by curiosity and professional duty. I couldn't leave Anna Mikhailovna without help, couldn't simply forget about the missing teacher and all those strange stories I had heard from the locals. I had to see it through to find out the truth about the far forest, no matter how terrifying it turned out to be. A week passed in tense anticipation. Mikhail Petrovich never returned home, and the official search organized by the local police yielded no results. A group of volunteers scoured the vicinity of the far forest but found no trace of the missing teacher. Anna Mikhailovna grew more desperate with each passing day, and I felt I had to do something more decisive than simply gathering information. My evenings were now spent in the small town library, where I studied the archives of the local newspaper, trying to find mentions of similar cases in the past. The librarian, an elderly woman named Lyudmila Sergeyevna, was initially surprised by my interest in old issues, but then, seeing my persistence, began to help me in my search. She told me that she herself remembered several strange stories related to the far forest, but had always dismissed them as ordinary gossip. In the archives, I found a 20-year-old note about the disappearance of a group of tourists who went hiking in the far forest and didn't return at the appointed time. They were searched for almost a month, and when all hope was lost, the tourists returned on their own. They claimed they had only been lost for a few hours and were extremely surprised to learn that so much time had passed. The article was written in a skeptical tone. The author clearly didn't believe the tourists' accounts and explained the incident as stress and disorientation. Another discovery proved more interesting: the diary of a local historian who, in the 1950s, researched the history of our region. In one entry, he mentioned that the far forest had a bad reputation since Tsarist times. Local peasants avoided it, considering it a cursed place where time flowed differently. The historian wrote that he intended to conduct research there, but there were no further entries in the diary. Lyudmila Sergeyevna told me that this historian did indeed exist, but simply disappeared one day, and nothing was known of his fate. Gradually, I began to understand that the matter wasn't limited to a few random disappearances. The far forest had been surrounded by an aura of mystery and fear for many decades, possibly even centuries. People instinctively felt that something was wrong there, something that didn't obey the ordinary laws of nature. But no one dared to seriously investigate this phenomenon, preferring simply to avoid the dangerous place. My own life became increasingly chaotic during these days. I slept poorly, often forgot to eat, and my articles for the newspaper became increasingly incoherent. Pyotr Semenovich hinted several times that if I didn't pull myself together, I might lose my job. But I was hardly worried about that anymore. I was obsessed with the idea of solving the mystery of the far forest, of understanding exactly what was happening there and why time behaved so strangely. I began to look for people who had been to the far forest themselves and returned with stories of lost time. This proved not so easy, as most of them preferred not to talk about their experience, and some had left town. However, I managed to find Marina Vladimirovna, a middle-aged woman who worked as a nurse in the local hospital. She agreed to meet me and tell her story. Marina Vladimirovna was a practical and sensible person, which is why her story made such a strong impression on me. She recounted that 5 years ago she had gone to the far forest for medicinal herbs. She knew the forest well, often gathering plants there for homemade tinctures and decoctions. On that day, she entered the forest in the morning and planned to return by lunchtime. Instead, she only found herself home 6 months later, though for her only a few hours had passed. According to her, in the forest, she noticed that something was wrong. The sun seemed to be frozen in the sky, the shadows of the trees didn't move, and sounds were muffled as if coming from afar. She tried to find her way back, but all the trails had vanished. The forest seemed endless, the trees stood too close to each other, and a thick fog stretched between them. She wandered, as it seemed to her, for several hours, and then suddenly found herself at the edge of the forest, not far from her home. At home, a shock awaited her. It turned out she had been missing for 6 months. She had been searched for extensively and then declared dead. Her husband had already started to process her death certificate, and her children had grown and changed. For everyone else, 6 months had passed, but for her, only a few hours. She remembered every minute of her time in the forest, but couldn't explain how it was possible. Marina Vladimirovna told me that after her return, she struggled for a long time to adapt to normal life. It seemed to her that the world around her had changed, becoming somehow wrong. She constantly felt that time was moving too fast, unable to keep up with the events happening around her. She spent several months in the hospital. Doctors treated her for depression and memory loss, but no one could explain what had happened to her. The most frightening part of her story was that she still heard voices from that forest. Especially at night, when everything quieted down, it seemed to her that someone was calling her name. She knew it was impossible, that the forest was several kilometers from the town, but the voices sounded so clear, as if their source was right next to her house. She said that several times she had woken up in the middle of the night with the feeling that she had to go to the forest, that something important was waiting for her there. After talking with Marina Vladimirovna, I understood that I was dealing with something far more serious and dangerous than simple disappearances. The far forest was not just a place where strange things happened. It was something alive, something that actively influenced the people who entered it. It seemed to draw them in, altered their perception of time and space, and then released them, but not completely. I began to notice that I too was starting to perceive the world around me differently. Time seemed to me sometimes too fast, sometimes too slow. Sometimes I sat at my desk and felt minutes stretch endlessly, and sometimes hours passed, leaving no trace in my memory. I became forgetful, distracted, often unable to recall what I had done a few hours earlier, but the most terrifying thing was that I also started to hear voices. At first, they were barely perceptible whispers, which I mistook for the sound of the wind or the creaking of the old house. But gradually they became clearer, and I realized that they were calling my name. The voices sounded melodic, almost hypnotic, and there was an irresistible allure to them. I tried to tell Pyotr Semenovich about it, but he just shook his head and advised me to take a vacation, to rest from work. He clearly believed I was overtired, too deeply engrossed in my investigation, and starting to lose touch with reality. Perhaps he was right, but I couldn't stop anymore. The mystery of the far forest had completely consumed me, and I felt I had to see it through to find out the truth, no matter how terrible. I decided to find another person who could tell me about their experience in the far forest. After a few days of searching, I managed to find out that an elderly man named Nikolai Stepanovich lived in a neighboring district, who allegedly spent several years in that forest, although for him only one night had passed. I contacted him by phone and he agreed to meet. Nikolai Stepanovich turned out to be a strange and nervous man. He was about 70 years old, but he looked much older. His hands constantly trembled, his eyes darted around, and his speech was broken and disjointed. He told me that he ended up in the far forest by chance, getting lost while hunting. This happened in the late 80s when he was still a young and strong man. According to him, he spent one night in the forest, but when he returned home, it turned out that 3 years had passed. His wife had remarried and his children had grown up and barely recognized him. He lost his job, his home, his entire former life. But the most terrifying thing was that he remembered every minute of that night in the forest, and these memories gave him no peace. Nikolai Stepanovich told me about what he saw in the forest. According to him, there was something there that could not be described in ordinary words. The trees were alive in the literal sense of the word. They moved, whispered among themselves, watched him. The ground beneath his feet was soft and warm, like living flesh. And in the very center of the forest, there was something he called the heart, a pulsating mass of light and darkness that controlled everything that happened in the forest. He said that the forest didn't just distort time, it fed on it. People who entered it gave the forest years of their lives and in return received a few hours in a strange world where completely different laws applied. The forest was hungry. It constantly needed new victims, and so it sent voices to attract people. Nikolai Stepanovich warned me that if I continued my investigation, sooner or later I wouldn't be able to resist the call of the forest. He said that he himself had tried to return there several times, but had always found the strength to refuse at the last moment. He knew that if he entered the forest again, he wouldn't be able to get out. After this meeting, I returned home in a state of complete confusion. The stories of people who had been in the far forest formed a frightening picture. The forest was not just an anomalous place, it was something alive, sentient, and malevolent that used people for its own purposes. It fed on their time, their lives, their souls, and in return gave them the false sensation that they had spent only a few hours there. I knew I had to stop the investigation, forget about the far forest, and return to normal life. But the voices which I heard more and more often told me otherwise. They whispered that only in the forest would I find answers to all my questions, that only there could I become a true journalist, write a story that would make me famous throughout the country. My life was completely out of control. I barely slept, ate only when hunger became unbearable, and stopped taking care of myself. Pyotr Semenovich tried to talk to me several times, but I barely heard his words. All my thoughts were occupied by the forest, and I felt that soon I would no longer be able to resist its call. Meanwhile, Mikhail Petrovich's disappearance was fading from memory. Officially, the search was called off. He was declared dead. Anna Mikhailovna fell into depression and barely left her house. Life in the town returned to its usual routine as if nothing had happened. Only I continued to think about the missing teacher and what he might have discovered in the far forest. I knew that the moment was approaching when I would have to make a decision. I could try to forget everything and return to normal life, or I could trust the voices and go into the forest to find answers to all my questions. And with each passing day, the second option seemed more and more appealing, despite all the terrifying stories I had heard from people who had been there. The decision came to me on a cold November morning when I woke up to the sound of my own voice. I was talking in my sleep, repeating the same word over and over, and that word was go. My apartment felt alien, uncomfortable, as if I were in it for the first time. All the objects were in their usual places, but something was off about them, as if they belonged to another person who had lived here long ago. I got up, went to the window, and saw that it was snowing outside. The first snow of the year, fine and wet, melting as soon as it touched the asphalt. People walked about their business wrapped in coats and scarves, none of them suspecting that a few kilometers from town lay a place where time flowed differently, where reality obeyed entirely different laws. I realized I could no longer live in ignorance. The voices I heard every night were becoming more insistent, and I felt I would soon be unable to resist them. It was better to go into the forest consciously, as a journalist doing his job, than to lose control of myself and end up there against my will. I spent the rest of the day preparing. I packed a backpack with essentials, a flashlight, a compass, some food, a bottle of water, a notebook, and a pen. I understood that if the stories were true, all of this might be useless, but the preparation helped me maintain the illusion of control over the situation. I wrote a letter to Pyotr Semenovich explaining that I was going on a business trip and would return in a few days. I couldn't tell him the truth. He would think I had completely lost my mind. That evening I sat at my desk for a long time, trying to write an article about my investigation. I wanted to leave some trace, a document that would explain to people what was happening in the far forest if I didn't return. But the words wouldn't come. My thoughts were muddled, and eventually I put down the pen. Perhaps some stories shouldn't be told until they are finished. The night passed sleeplessly. I lay in bed listening to the voices, which now sounded so clear as if their source was right in my room. They whispered my name, promising to show me things that would change my understanding of the world. They spoke of time as a river that could flow in different directions, of space as a fabric that could be folded and unfolded at will. Dawn found me fully prepared for the journey. I had breakfast, though the food tasted bland like cardboard, put on warm clothes, and took my backpack. Before leaving, I looked around the apartment one last time, trying to commit every detail to memory. I had a strange feeling that I was seeing this place for the last time, although rationally I knew I should be back in a few hours. The walk to the far forest took longer than I expected. I went on foot as there was no bus and I didn't own a car. First I walked along a paved road, then turned onto a dirt path that led through fields and small groves. The further I moved from the town, the stronger the feeling became that I was entering another world, where different laws applied. The weather worsened. The snow grew thicker, the wind intensified, and soon I could barely make out the path ahead. Several times I lost my way, but each time I found it again, as if some force guided my steps. I began to understand that going into the forest in such weather was madness, but I couldn't stop. The voices grew louder, and they no longer pleaded. They demanded. When I finally saw the first trees of the far forest, it was almost dark. The forest looked exactly as I had imagined it, dark, dense, almost impenetrable. The trees stood so close together that one could barely squeeze between them. Their branches intertwined, forming a dense canopy through which no light penetrated. There was no snow on the ground here. Apparently, it couldn't get through the thick foliage. I stopped at the edge of the forest and turned on my flashlight. The beam of light seemed weak and pathetic in the face of this primeval darkness. I knew that as soon as I took the first step into the forest, I wouldn't be able to turn back. It was like crossing an invisible boundary beyond which an entirely different world began. The first few steps into the forest brought nothing unusual. Dry leaves crunched underfoot, an owl hooted somewhere in the distance, and the air smelled of damp leaves and dampness. I walked slowly, shining my flashlight ahead, trying not to get lost. There was no path here. I had to force my way between trees, around thick bushes and fallen trunks. But gradually I began to notice oddities. First, the sounds. They had changed somehow, becoming muffled as if coming from afar. My own voice, when I tried to say something aloud, sounded unnatural, as if I were speaking in an empty room. Second, the air. It became thicker, heavier. Each breath required effort. And finally, time. I had been walking for quite a while, but I felt only a few minutes had passed. I looked at my watch and saw that the hands had stopped. This could mean the watch was broken, but somehow I knew that wasn't it. Time truly behaved differently here. It didn't stop, but flowed unevenly, sometimes accelerating, sometimes slowing down. Like a river with a fluctuating current, the trees around me grew taller and thicker. Their trunks were covered with moss that glowed with a faint greenish light. This light didn't illuminate the surrounding space, but created a strange atmosphere, making the forest resemble an underwater kingdom. I turned off my flashlight as the moss provided enough light to see where I was going. The deeper I ventured into the forest, the more surreal everything became. The trees began to take on bizarre forms, their branches bending in impossible directions, and their roots crawling out of the ground, forming intricate patterns. I saw faces in the bark of the trees, heard the whispers of the leaves, felt hundreds of invisible eyes watching me. The voices that had led me here now sounded very close. They no longer whispered my name, but engaged in a genuine conversation among themselves, discussing me like an exhibit in a museum. I couldn't make out the words, but I felt they were speaking an ancient language that existed long before humans. I walked further and further, losing all sense of time and space. The forest seemed endless, yet at the same time I felt I was moving in circles, passing the same places over and over again. The trees around me changed, but something about them remained constant, as if they were parts of one enormous organism. Suddenly I saw a light ahead. Not the greenish glow of the moss, but a real bright light, like sunlight. I hurried towards it, pushing through dense thickets, and soon emerged into a clearing. What I saw there made me stop in astonishment. In the middle of the clearing stood a house, an ordinary wooden house with a porch, windows, and a smoking chimney. Warm yellow light poured from the windows, and smoke rose from the chimney. The house looked cozy and inviting, completely out of place with the gloomy atmosphere of the forest. Next to the house was a small vegetable garden where vegetables grew, and a well with a well sweep. I approached closer and saw that the house door was ajar. Sounds came from within, someone walking around the room, cooking something, humming softly. I peered through the window and saw an elderly man sitting at a table writing. He was dressed in a simple shirt and waistcoat. He was bald and gray hair stuck out in all directions. The man looked up, glanced at the window, and smiled when he saw me. He stood up, went to the door, and swung it wide open. There was no surprise in his eyes, as if he had been expecting my appearance. Come in, he said amiably. I've been waiting for you for a long time. My name is Mikhail Petrovich. I recognized him, even though he had aged considerably. It was the missing teacher, Anna Mikhailovna's husband, whom I had been looking for weeks. But he looked as if not weeks, but years had passed. His face was covered in deep wrinkles, his hair had turned completely gray, and his back was stooped with age. Mikhail Petrovich, I repeated, but how, you only disappeared a month ago. A month, he said, surprised. No, I've been here for a very long time. But come in, don't stand in the doorway, I just put the kettle on. I entered the house, and it felt as if I had stepped into another era. The furnishings were simple but cozy. Wooden chairs, a large table covered with oilcloth, a Russian stove in the corner. Photographs hung on the walls which seemed very old, although in some of them I recognized residents of our town. Mikhail Petrovich placed a cup of tea in front of me and sat down opposite. He looked calm and serene, nothing like a man who had unwillingly found himself in a strange place. You're probably a journalist, he said. I was warned you would come. Do you want to know the truth about this place? I nodded, not trusting my voice. Mikhail Petrovich took a sip of tea and began to speak. This forest has existed for a very long time, he said. Much longer than our town, than our country, than human civilization itself. It appeared at a time when the world was completely different, when time and space obeyed different laws. The forest remembers that time and doesn't want to change. He told me that the forest was not just a place but a living being, intelligent and ancient. It fed on time, taking years of people's lives and using that energy to sustain its existence. People who entered the forest didn't just lose time. They became part of the forest. Their life force was woven into its structure. But why do people return? I asked. Not everyone returns, Mikhail Petrovich replied. Some stay forever, and those who return carry a part of the forest within them. They become its agents in the human world, attracting new victims. The voices you heard are the voices of those who remained in the forest forever. I understood that I, too, had already become part of this process. The forest had used me to draw attention to itself, and now that I was here, it had no intention of letting me go. Mikhail Petrovich confirmed my suspicions. You won't be able to return, he said sadly. Just like me. We will live here in this house in this time that doesn't move forward. We will age, but very slowly, and each day will be like the last. He showed me the photographs on the walls. They depicted people I recognized from the stories of locals, those who had disappeared into the forest over many years. All of them had lived in this house. All of them were prisoners of the forest. What about those who return? I asked. They return because the forest allows them to, Mikhail Petrovich explained. But they are no longer the same people. They carry the seeds of the forest within them, and sooner or later these seeds will sprout. They will become conduits between our world and the world of the forest. I realized I was trapped. The forest didn't just attract people to itself. It created a complex system that allowed it to influence the human world. Those who returned became its agents, attracting new victims, spreading its influence. Mikhail Petrovich stood up and went to the window. Outside, trees swayed slowly, though there was no wind. The forest is very patient, he said. It can wait for decades until it finds the right person. It chooses those who can tell its story, draw attention to it. Journalists, writers, researchers, all those who can become its voice in the human world. I understood that I had not been chosen by chance. My work, my character, my investigative bent, all of it made me an ideal target for the forest. It had used the story of Mikhail Petrovich's disappearance to draw my attention, and then gradually pulled me into its web. The night passed in long conversations. Mikhail Petrovich told me about the history of the forest, about those who had lived in the house before us, about the plans the forest had for human civilization. The picture that emerged from his stories was truly horrifying. The forest was not content with individual victims. It planned to gradually expand its influence, create a network of agents in the human world who would attract more and more people. The ultimate goal was the absorption of all human civilization, turning people into a source of energy to sustain its existence. In the morning, although there was no morning or evening in the forest, only eternal twilight, I realized I had to try to escape. I could not accept the fate of a prisoner of the forest. I could not allow it to use me for its plans. Mikhail Petrovich understood my intentions and sadly shook his head. It's useless, he said. I also tried to escape, as did many others, but the forest doesn't release its prisoners. You can go, but you will always return here. This place will become your home, whether you want it to or not, but I couldn't give up without a fight. I said goodbye to Mikhail Petrovich and left the house. The forest greeted me with the same greenish glow, the same whispering voices, the same atmosphere of ancient, unfathomable evil. But now I knew what I was dealing with, and that knowledge gave me strength. I started looking for a way out of the forest, but quickly realized it was hopeless. The trees around me changed. Paths disappeared and reappeared, and directions lost all meaning. I could walk north but end up south. I could climb a hill but descend into a valley. The forest played with me like a cat with a mouse, but I kept walking, driven by despair and the last vestiges of hope. I didn't know how much time had passed. Hours, days, weeks. In the forest, time didn't matter. The only thing I knew for sure was that I had to find a way out. I had to tell people the truth about what was happening in the far forest. My attempts to find a way out of the forest continued for what felt like days or weeks. In this place, time had lost all meaning. I wandered among trees that grew ever taller and thicker, their crowns interwoven into an impenetrable dome overhead, allowing not even a hint of the sky to penetrate. The greenish glow of the moss was the only source of light in this world of eternal twilight, and I had long since stopped trying to turn on my flashlight. Its batteries had died, though I couldn't recall it working for so long. The voices haunted me constantly. Now they didn't whisper my name but held entire conversations discussing my fate with the indifference of scientists studying a laboratory rat. They spoke of how long I could resist, of the role I would play in their plans, of whom I would attract to the forest once I became their agent. Sometimes among these voices I distinguished familiar intonations, the voices of the people I had spoken with during my investigation. Those who had supposedly returned from the forest. I understood the terrible truth. No one ever truly returned from the far forest. All those people who told me their stories were not real people but projections of the forest, its puppets, created to lure me in. Marina Vladimirovna, Nikolai Stepanovich, even Vasily Ivanovich. They were all part of a complex illusion that the forest had created specifically for me. This thought struck me more powerfully than any physical pain. I realized that I had been deceived from the very beginning, that my investigation was not a search for truth but a journey along a pre-laid path. The forest had studied me, analyzed my weaknesses, my fears, my desires, and created precisely the story that was bound to inevitably lead me here. But the most terrifying part was yet to come. Gradually, I began to understand that Mikhail Petrovich's disappearance was not an accident, but part of the plan. Anna Mikhailovna, who had come to the editorial office begging for help, was also a projection of the forest. The real math teacher perhaps never existed, or if he did, he had vanished so long ago that no one remembered his true face. The forest had created an entire network of false memories, false people, false events, to ensnare me in its clutches. It was patient, ingenious, and possessed abilities that far surpassed human understanding. It could penetrate people's minds, create illusions indistinguishable from reality, and manipulate memory and perception. I continued to walk, though I knew it was useless. Each step led me further from the human world, deeper into the realm of the forest. The trees around me changed, taking on increasingly fantastic forms. Their trunks twisted into spirals, branches intertwined into intricate patterns, and roots formed arches and tunnels. I saw faces in the bark of the trees, but now I understood that it wasn't just a trick of the imagination. These were the faces of those who had entered the forest before me and become a part of it. Among these faces, I recognized some residents of our town, people who had disappeared at various times over many years. Their eyes were open but vacant, and their lips moved silently, as if they were trying to say something. I realized that these were the true victims of the forest, not those who supposedly returned with tales of lost time, but those who remained here forever, becoming part of the ancient and malevolent organism. My own sanity began to fray. I talked to myself, answered questions no one asked, argued with invisible interlocutors. Reality blurred. The boundaries between dream and waking disappeared. Sometimes I felt as if I were walking on the familiar streets of my town, and sometimes as if I were floating on an ocean of green light. Hunger and thirst tormented me less and less. My body seemed to adapt to existence in this place, beginning to feed on the same energy that nourished the forest. I felt myself changing, the human part of my essence gradually dissolving, giving way to something else, ancient and inhuman. In one moment of relative clarity, I realized I had to try to leave some trace, some warning for those who might come after me. I took my notebook and pen from my backpack but found I couldn't write. My hand wouldn't obey me, the pen slipped from my fingers, and when I did manage to make a few marks, the ink vanished, as if absorbed by the paper. The forest did not want its secret revealed. It was willing to let me suffer, wander, go mad, but it would not allow me to leave any traces that could warn other people of the danger. I was doomed to become another nameless, disappeared person, another victim who would soon be forgotten. Gradually, I began to understand that the struggle was useless. The forest was too strong, too ancient, too cunning. It had existed for thousands of years, consumed hundreds of people, and I was just another victim in its endless feast. My human will, my mind, my individuality, all of it was just food for its hungry existence. I stopped in the middle of a clearing, surrounded by trees that leaned toward me like giant predators ready to attack. The greenish glow grew brighter, and I saw what I had been searching for from the beginning: the heart of the forest. It was a pulsating mass of light and darkness that constantly shifted, taking on various forms. Sometimes it resembled a giant tree, sometimes a colossal heart, sometimes something utterly unimaginable. The voices grew louder. They sounded from everywhere at once, creating a cacophony that would drive any human mad. But I was no longer entirely human. A part of me already belonged to the forest, and that part understood the voices, translating their messages into a comprehensible form. The forest told me its story. It was older than humanity, older than most life forms on Earth. It remembered times when the planet was entirely different, when the laws of physics worked differently, when magic was as real as gravity or electricity. The forest was one of the last fragments of that ancient world, and it clung desperately to existence, feeding on the energy of younger life forms. Humans were merely a food source for it, but a particularly valuable one. Human consciousness, human emotions, human time. All of this was a delicacy for the ancient being. The forest could exist by feeding on plants and animals, but only by consuming humans could it grow, develop, and plan for the future. And it did indeed have plans. The forest was not content with individual victims. It wanted to spread its influence throughout the world, to turn human civilization into an energy source for its existence. It dreamed of a time when the entire planet would be covered by similar forests, when humans would live in eternal twilight, feeding the ancient masters of the earth with their lives. I realized that my role in this plan had been determined even before I learned of the forest's existence. I was to become one of its agents, return to the human world and attract new victims. My status as a journalist, my reputation, my connections, all of this made me an ideal tool for spreading the forest's influence, but something inside me still resisted. Perhaps it was the last spark of humanity, perhaps simply an instinct for self-preservation. I knew I had to try to do something to stop the forest, or at least slow its plans. I approached the heart of the forest and reached out my hand. The touch was like an electric shock, but I didn't pull my hand back. I felt the forest's consciousness penetrate my mind, its thoughts merging with mine. It was horrifying and at the same time mesmerizing. I saw the world through the eyes of a being that had lived for thousands of years, that remembered the birth and death of civilizations. At that moment, I understood what I could do. The forest was strong, but it had a weakness. It was too old, too attached to the past. It could not adapt to a rapidly changing world. It could not understand modern human psychology. That was why it needed people who could become its conduits into the modern world. I began to think of the most painful memories from my life, of moments when I felt broken, defeated, desperate. The forest greedily devoured these emotions, but along with them it also consumed my human weakness, my inability to cope with the modern world. I thought about my boring job, my loneliness, about how I had fled the big city because I couldn't survive there. I thought about how easily I had been deceived, how simply the forest had made me believe in the existence of people who never were. I filled my mind with all the bitterness, all the despair, all the helplessness of a man who couldn't find his place in the world. The forest didn't understand what was happening. It thought I was giving up, accepting its will. But in reality, I was poisoning it with my human weakness, my inability to adapt, my longing for the past. The ancient being that had lived for thousands of years could not comprehend the existential crisis of a modern human. I felt the forest begin to change. Its thoughts became more chaotic, more contradictory. It began to doubt its plans, its ability to understand the modern world. My human melancholy was a poison to it, corroding its ancient certainty. But this was a Pyrrhic victory. By poisoning the forest with my weakness, I was poisoning myself. I felt my personality dissolve, my memories mingle with the forest's memories. I was dying, but I hoped that the forest would not survive my death. My consciousness began to disintegrate. I saw myself as a child playing in a garden. At the same time, I was an ancient tree reaching for the sun. I remembered my first love and simultaneously remembered the first humans the forest had consumed. I was a journalist, a teacher, a hunter, a local historian, all those who had become part of the forest. In the last moments of clarity, I understood that the forest was dying. It could not cope with the chaos I had introduced into its ordered existence. For thousands of years, it had lived by specific laws, fed on specific emotions, followed specific instincts. But my modern human soul, full of contradictions and doubts, was too toxic for it. The trees around me began to wither. Their greenish glow dimmed, leaves fell, trunks cracked. The voices quieted one by one until only one remained, my own voice repeating my name over and over until it dissolved into silence. I felt the ground beneath my feet begin to crumble. The forest was disappearing, and with it the world in which I had spent the last weeks or months. Reality was tearing at the seams, time began to flow backward, space collapsed into a point. The last thing I remember is the sensation of falling. I fell through layers of time, through strata of memory, through fragments of collapsing reality. I saw the faces of all those who had been victims of the forest, and they smiled at me, thanking me for their liberation. I fell into the snow at the edge of the far forest. It was cold, windy, and snow was still falling from the gray sky. I lay there, unable to move, feeling life slowly leave my body. The forest behind me was an ordinary forest. The trees stood motionless. There was no greenish glow, no voices. I knew I was dying. The struggle with the forest had exhausted all my strength, and now my body refused to serve me. But I had no regrets about what had happened. I knew that the forest was destroyed, that no one else would become its victim. That was all that mattered. The snow covered me, and the world gradually plunged into darkness. In the last moments of my life, I thought that my story would never be told. No one would know what happened in the far forest. No one would understand the price that had to be paid for the destruction of ancient evil. But perhaps that was for the best. Some stories should not be told. Some secrets should die with those who uncover them. The world became a little safer, and that was the only reward I needed. I closed my eyes and allowed the snow to cover me. Somewhere far away, church bells rang, announcing the dawn of a new day. But for me, that day would never come. I would remain here on the border between the human world and what was once the far forest, like a silent guardian, protecting a secret that must remain forever buried. The last thought that flashed through my mind before darkness completely engulfed me was that death is not the end, but simply a transition to another state. I became part of the boundary that separates the world of humans from the world of ancient forces. And if ever anything like the forest tries to penetrate the human world again, I will be here to stop it. The snow continued to fall, covering my body, and soon no trace of me remained. In the spring, mushroom pickers will find my frozen form, and the official conclusion will state that I died of hypothermia, lost in the forest. No one will know the truth of what happened. No one will understand the sacrifice I made, but the far forest will never again pose a danger. The ancient evil is destroyed, and people can safely go there for mushrooms and berries. Time flows normally again. Space obeys ordinary laws, and the voices no longer call anyone to the cursed place. My story ended, but the world continues to exist, and perhaps that is the only thing that truly matters.